And how diverse the Middle East remains today, because these cultures were there long, long before Islam, before the rise of Islam. And at the same time, most of these cultural variations remain as part of the great diversity in the Middle East. A lot of diversity in the Middle East. Everybody thinks Middle East, oh, Arabs and camels. No. There are a few other things. There's a lot of other things. Levels of skill, levels of education, levels of scientific investigation, just tons of stuff. And so I consider part of my job to at least try to get people to understand that and look at it, how diverse it is. Because when you do that, you just get a different feeling about the Middle East, and you get a different sense of what it's about. You get the sense of the historic richness of the region, of its major contributions. So we were talking about the contributions. Okay, one of the things that came out of the Mesopotamian experience, one of the earliest cultures, I didn't mention it last time, I mentioned this, and that is the way we count time. There's 24 hours in a day, right? Is that an invention or a discovery?
Invention.
So who said discovery? You said discovery? You said, who said? No, somebody said, I heard somebody say discovery. Right. Oh yeah, yeah. Okay. No, the divisions are into 24 hours is a total invention. But who invented it? And we still use it. It comes from the Sumerians, earliest people in the history of civilization. They divide time into 12 hours in the day, 12 hours in the night, and then they divide the hours into 60 minutes. And the use of 60 seconds, 60 minutes, and 24 hours, it's a total invention. Now, there must have been a reason they did it that way, but I don't think anybody has really explained it. Some people associate it with the religion at the time, but we don't know enough about Sumerian religion to know what would be the relationship. We know that in the Old Testament there is the what? The creation in 6 days. Okay, so there's 6. But again, it's highly. It's not that they were just trying to figure out something. They weren't like doing what they did in a like stepping back and saying, you know, I have time on my hands. Let's invent a way to measure time, a way to capture time. They were busy trying to stay alive. So this was done for a very practical reason. Next, we hop into, I'll show you the example of practical reasons. In the context of ancient Egypt, just about the same time, the Egyptians developed the 365 and 1/4 day calendar. Now, is that an invention? Or is that a discovery? It's a discovery. Because you only have so many days in a year, but how do you know that? Well, the way the Egyptians figured it out was they had it based on the flooding of the Nile. Nile floods once a year for a number of months. The flood means everybody has to move out of the Nile Valley. All the villages are inundated by the floodwaters. It doesn't happen today because of the Aswan High Dam absorbing the flood and all of that alluvial soil that comes from the highlands of Ethiopia. But at the same time, that situation is caused the Egyptians to start thinking, you know, what we need to do is measure the flood of the Nile. We need to know how big it's going to be in order how much to evacuate. And we need to know this because every year it's not exactly the same. Some years you have drought. Some years you have flooding, big super floods. A lot of people die. They need to know how much food they're going to grow. And an average flood is going to give you a very abundant crop. But they need to know that. They need to know how to protect their people and organize it this way. So Egypt's rulers concocted an idea of building Nileometers way up the Nile. So you see the flood stage of the Nile coming, and you measure it, and you know, this is going to be a big one. It's going to be a bad year, big flood. And so they have the Nileometers. They have torches they light, like lighthouses, and signals all the way down the Nile, all the way down to the Mediterranean, from Upper Egypt into the Mediterranean, letting them know this is the Nile flood is coming and it's going to be bad. There's ways of doing this, almost like a telegraphic system, like smoke signals, only it's fire. So they were doing that, and that gave them a handle on how to protect the people. But the big question starts is when does, what's your last name again? Okay. So the one thing they need to try and remember is make sure the Nile flood, they can predict when it's actually going to come. Can they predict it? So in the middle of that prediction, they developed a real sensitivity to when does this thing start. Well, it seems to start, using our calendar, about June the 21st every year. Well, that turns out to be very providential. Why? June the 21st is the longest day of the year. It's summer solstice. Now, why would the Nile flood start with summer solstice? Don't know. But it seemed to hit right around that time almost every year. There he is. He's here. Yeah, okay. Good morning. Good morning. Good. Wonderful. So it starts, and you have the flood lasts, roughly the flood season lasts through the summer and the fall. That means you cannot work the fields. And the Egyptians took advantage of that by building a lot of the big building projects during the time of the flood. Flood's on, can't work your farms, you can't survive in that situation. So it's at that time that the pharaohs, and this happened during the Old Kingdom, very Old Kingdom, meaning about 3000 BC, that the pharaohs gave orders to start construction of the pyramids. Pyramids for their eternal life, okay. They could do it in the off-season of the Nile. Nile's flooding, you can do this. I mean, I would not want to have been an Egyptian. I work my farm in the good months, and I haul, 40-ton stones when I'm not working the farm. That doesn't sound good. It sounds like a bad, this is like, but they did it. And it wasn't slave labor. It's farm labor, guys that are already used to backbreaking toil. They're doing all the pulling. Okay. So then you have skilled laborers working on the stones, cutting the stones and so forth. Master masons really knew what they were doing. You had architects and everything. But it's all during the off season. It's all during the flood season. So when does the flood season go away? It appeared to go away just about the time we celebrate what? Winter solstice. December 21st. Remember that was the Maya Doomsday last year, wasn't it? Wasn't that Doomsday? Yeah, 21st. Was it the 23rd?
It was the 21st.
Okay. Yeah, I stick with him because he agrees with me. You don't. Be quiet. So. So with that thing in mind, the Egyptians began to put together that you have longest day, shortest day, and they counted how many days between one and the other. Okay, what's a half a year's worth of days? 365 divided by 2 gives you what?
182 and a half.
182 and a half. Okay. Now, and they did it the other direction, from winter to summer again, 182. We got it. There's 365 days here. So they identified, they built the first calendar using the solar calendar, 365 days, and that's all they had. But as the years went on, and that way they could predict the flood with accuracy. The calendar here, it's June the 21st, time for the flood to start. But they noticed the flood started coming later all the time. That never happened before. So something's wrong with their prediction, something's wrong with their calculation. What's wrong with it is that they forgot the 1/4 day. They didn't know there was a 4th day attached to the 365. So once they figured that out, they added an extra day every 4 years. And that's where we come up with leap year. So this is they invented this. You imagine you're waking up in the morning to a clock that gives you 60 minutes, gives you 24-hour days, courtesy of the Sumerians, and a calendar that tells you what day it is, where you're going to be, when winter starts, courtesy of the ancient Egyptians. We still use it. Now, what does that tell you? What it means is, first of all, the system worked. Number one, it works well, satisfies basic human demands, ideas. And then next, it also tells us that this is when the continuity of civilization, the continuity of the ideas, continued uninterrupted. In other words, there was not a major invasion force that ever came into Egypt or the Mesopotamian Valley that destroyed those ideas. Those ideas continue with us. It's continuity of very rich ideas. And that is one of the great contributions the Middle East makes, is this, regardless of how much people talk about chaos going on today in the Middle East, it doesn't matter. Because for thousands of years, this region was stable, very stable. And they held on to the things they invented, to the things they discovered, and passed them on. That's the important thing. For instance, we don't use a Chinese calendar. Nobody can remember what it was like. Calendars that were developed in the Indus Valley scenario in northwest India, huge civilization. But we don't know anything about it. Great civilization of which we know nothing, except it was there and it was big. We can't read a word of their script. Why? Invasion took place and destroyed the documents, destroyed all memory of that language, and to this day, we don't have a grip on what this civilization was able to do. We only have one example of that in the West, and that's in the Eastern Mediterranean, and that was the Minoans. Minoans had a very, very, I'd say, sophisticated civilization, but we still don't know a lot about it because we can't read their language. Don't know, to this day, nobody can read Minoan. Nobody knows how. It's not related to Greek, it's not a Semitic language, it's just out there. But beautiful language, looks great, but no, we can't read it. But because the languages are preserved in the Middle East, this is why it's so important. This is why we have so much that's there today. Okay, any questions about any of this stuff? Yeah?
What was the life expectancy of
Egyptians?
Yeah.
You know, it's debatable, but probably you can go about 35 to 40. Actually, it's better than it is in the Middle Ages in Europe.
It is.
Middle Ages in Europe, your life expectancy was 32. So you had to have your midlife crisis when you were 16.
Sounds good.
I don't know how they ever got anything done. It's about the time you get ready to start your career, you're dead. You know, go to college, it's over. That's why college was so short. They had 2 years. Some of these guys had doctor's degrees, 2 years at Oxford. They had to get it done. Because, you know, by the time you get to be a senior, the way we talk senior, you're already gone. You've passed on to your reward, you know, which was the A you got in Latin. That's your reward. Okay, so then you turn to some of the religious things. Just about everything we could ever think of religiously starts in this region. We talked about Abraham coming out of the Mesopotamian period coming out of the old Babylonian empire of Hammurabi, the height of that culture, height of expansion, belief in one God. That comes from their narrative both in the Bible and in the Koran talk about this, Abraham's call. Now here's the difference between, and here's what's significant about it. One of the things that makes Islam, Christianity, and Judaism really unique, and people don't really talk about this much, is the fact that it's not people discovering God, but it's God breaking into human history and saying, hey, you, I love you, I care about you, all these things. It's his communication. It's not nature. Breaks into nature, breaks into human existence, breaks into human history, and creates out of that our process in the West of historical thinking. Meaning that history goes from something, the time of God's creation, God's salvation, and God's ultimate redemption. I mean, it's what we call straight line linear thinking, linear history. It gives us linear history. The Greeks gave us historical thinking too, but it's circular history. History moves in cycles, 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 cycles. But the general thinking in the West looks at history as having a destination and a goal. That comes out of the situation. Apart from this, there would be no Judaism, Christianity, or Islam apart from God's coming into history. It's very important in all three. All three of the faiths have the same basic, I say, unifying factor. The Prophet Muhammad talks about the appearance of God, the appearance of the angel Gabriel to him, and giving him eventually the Quran. Moses talks about God speaking to him in the mountain, giving him the 10 Commandments, and bagels and kosher pickles. Christians talk about the Jesus walked the earth, that he is the Son of God. He walked the earth and has communication with us. He's born of a virgin. All these, that he comes into the human situation. All of them have the same, that is the connection. They're not all identical, but that connection is what's important. Now, typically in religion in the region, this is unique, but typically in religion, polytheistic religions of the region, just about covering all of the Middle East, for sure, wasn't that way. They're out there looking for God, discovering gods identified with what? Signs of the zodiac, stars, the planets, and so forth are identified as many, many gods. So this is different. So you have both. You have both polytheism and you have monotheism of the various sorts coming out of this region. Now, one exception to this, a very strange exception, occurs in Egypt in the period of the late 18th dynasty, and that is about 1400 or so BC. We have a pharaoh who was raised in the polytheistic tradition of Egypt, worship of the god Amun-Ra, and the priesthood that served Amun-Ra, and his first name was Ankhenaten. He then converts to a belief in a god, the face of the sun, which is called the Aton, A-T-O-N, and he changes his name to Akhenaten, meaning he who serves the god Aton, A-T-O-N, the belief in one God. Now this is the pharaoh we have statues of him at Cairo Museum and several other locations, but Cairo has a ton of them. Where he has the elongated head, he looks like he has a very long face, and if you've ever watched Ancient Aliens, they're convinced that he was an alien, and that, I mean, seriously, History 130, History Channel 130, ancient.
Have you noticed his hair has gotten progressively more gray?
Oh, that guy is nuts. Yeah.
He like changed it. It's
Electric, he puts electricity in every day.
I think he's an alien.
Looks like the Bride of Frankenstein, yeah, I know. George something, yeah, he's got a Greek last name. And the Greeks are crazy, we know that. Anybody here Greek? We can offend you all the time. Little Greek, I'm only a little Greek. So ancient.
That's what he does. He does this.
I mean, that show, it used to be fascinating, but then I realized it's so much horse manure that it really, and it's really a belief system. They're really into it. And all these guys that are writing these books, they all quote one another. So they keep it in the family. You know? Okay, just stay right there. Move back to Utah. Okay. Okay. Don't forget Saturday we're playing. Who are we playing? Montana Tech.
Yeah.
Here, I'm looking forward to that. Because now they have a beer garden. As you walk in, it's the worst beer I've ever had, but it's there. And you can't take it with you to up to the stadium. You gotta just sit there and get schnocked, and you know, then you can't. Where's the stadium? It's right there, man. Anyway, I'm gonna go with a couple. Walter's going, and Tom Patterson just retired from teaching at University of Connecticut, history professor there. And maybe Sean McEnroe, we're trying to shame him into it. Trying to get a little athletic. And my good news this week has been that USC fired Lane Kiffin, the coach there. He's the worst coach we ever had.
You see that they can even repossess his house?
They can repossess his house?
Yeah, they can repossess Lane Kiffin's house. They give him a $500,000 loan. And upon being fired or quitting, they can demand that he pay that money back with interest.
That's worth a
Or
lot of student
take it out.
scholarships. Yeah, yeah.
I think they should just disband the school.
You think?
Then Boise State.
It's the bright spot of civilization in South Central LA. You talking about it? This is it.
Our star, our shining example.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so Akhenaten believed in some kind of a divine revelation, and he outlawed the worship of other gods in Egypt at the time. Considered radical, revolutionary, some consider him absolutely crazy. The country went through a period of brief civil war and restored the old religion under the pharaoh Tutankhamun that everybody knows about, who only lived to be about 18 before he died. Died of, we don't know, possibly battle wounds, might have been beat up in battle, had a terrible infection in one leg, discovered that would have killed him, the gangrene would have killed him. Did he get it because he was assassinated, or did he get it because of battle? But we know he died of that. Okay. It's the end of the 18th dynasty, and then you have the incident that becomes very big, again, in Western history, in Western religion history, and that's the Exodus. The Exodus is very controversial because it does not show up in any of the Egyptian records, but it shows up as a big part of the Hebrew record in the Old Testament, starting with the book of Exodus. Exodus, we call the 5 books of Moses, at least traditionally written about that time, about the time of Moses, which is about around 1200 or so BC. So, assuming Egyptian records don't talk about it, and we've never found a record that ever says any of this happened, but there are a couple of things that are very important that show up there. In Egyptian records, that begin to shed some light on it. Number one, all of the pharaohs of that particular dynasty, the 18th and 19th dynasty, all have, almost all of them have a name that ends with, or begins with the term Moses. You have the founder of the dynasty is Ahmoses. You have the great rulers of that dynasty, Tutmosis. You have the greatest ruler ever ruled Egypt, Ramoses. So the name Moses shows up in this particular dynasty. So it tells us that and because the name Moses is not a popular name following the 19th dynasty, it was never a big name in any of the early dynasties. It wasn't even, in fact, it never shows up at all. But all of a sudden you have these names showing up constantly, and they're all related to Moses, one way or the other. So the nomenclature at the time is helps us connect to that period. So we know it occurred somewhere within that vicinity. And then we come to, in the book of Exodus, it talks about that the children of Israel were enslaved and that they're going to be working to build the city, the treasure city of the Pharaoh, Ramses treasure city, called Ramses. It has two names, P. Ramses. Nobody's ever heard of this city. Ever. Until about 20 years ago. They dug up references to P. Ramses. And they said, well, where is it? It's supposed to be the biggest city ever built in Egypt. Built because Pharaoh Ramses was the biggest egomaniac in Egyptian history. He's building the city. It's named after him. It's a treasure city for all the treasure, for all of the various battles that he fought. He lived to be 92. This is a remarkable character. Most Egyptians were all dying at about 35, and he lives to be 92. It's just an incredible, and he's got red hair. He's a Viking. Come on now. He's an alien, I guarantee it. So, I go to the Cairo. Yeah, you want to go to the Cairo Museum today, and you got to see the sarcophagus. I mean, you don't want to really go there today because it's not in good shape. But give it a couple of years, things will calm down. We get to go back to Cairo Museum. But you see this. You look at the mummy of Ramses. He's still got the tuft of red hair. He's 5'6". You say, well, that's not. At that time, most guys were like 5'1". So he's bigger than everybody else, lives longer than anybody, and he's got red hair. And now they have found the city of P. Ramses. It's huge. But it was deserted 100 years after it was built because the Nile Delta changed flood seasons. So you had a flood. You had a river, a branch of the Nile, running right through where that city used to be. And then when that river dried up, you couldn't stay there any longer. There's no water. So eventually the city is deserted. Then they try to do what Egyptians know how to do this the best: move all that stuff that they had put there to another city called Tanis, also located in the Nile Delta, but located about 50 miles away. You know what a project that would be? To move all this is all stone stuff. And then they find all of the smaller buildings are made with brick and straw. And that comes right out of the book of Exodus. So you got the name of the Pharaoh, you found a city, we found the building techniques that are mentioned in Exodus. You know you've got something going on here. And then just a generation later, one of the sons of Ramses, named Merneptah, I have to write this down. Merneptah is another Egyptian god. Merneptah, the one who worships and serves the god Ptah, Merneptah. Ptah is the god of the Nile. So Merneptah leaves a record that the Egyptian army has invaded into the land, into Canaan to the north, which is Palestine today. Invaded into Canaan. And as they got there, they encountered a Bedouin tribe coming across the Jordan River into Canaan. And they identified the tribe as Israel. So it's the first name of Israel. It shows up 40 years after the time that Ramses would have tried to destroy the Israelites at the Red Sea. 40 years later, the son of Ramses, finally lived long enough to become Pharaoh, shows up and he's attacking Israel. And it talks about them using a tribal hieroglyphics showing that this is divided into tribes. They're not a unified country at all. And the comment is very typical propagandistic comment. We have encountered Israel and we have destroyed their seed, and they won't come back again. In other words, we cleaned them out. Well, we know that didn't happen. We know there was a battle, because he talks about other tribes that he fights, but the name shows up and it's on a stele. It's called the Stele of Merneptah. It's at the Cairo Museum. M-E-R-N-E-P-T-A-H, Stele of Merneptah. First mention of Israel. It's never mentioned during the days of Ramses. But it's mentioned here. So what I think all this does is shows us that this material largely confirms one of the primary ingredients in, I'd say, the story of Western history and the story of the relationship of God to man, is that this happened. It's verifiable. It's not just a biblical fairy tale. That we can confirm this from the Egyptian record as well. But it's not the Egyptian record giving us all the details, but it's giving us enough to know that we can put this together and have a sense of reliability about it. Okay. Any questions about any of this stuff? Okay, now we go to the Arabian Peninsula, same period of time. Actually, I want to come back to that rather than do it the second. I'll stick with something. I mean, we've got it, and we have to have enough time today to have a half hour. Would be good.
Half hour. It's too much. Maybe 20 minutes.
Okay.
Yeah.
I will.
Okay.
All right. It's our Arabic lesson coming up. 20-minute Arabic lesson.
Oh.
You live or die by this lesson. Okay, it's going to be great. Just be glad I'm not doing it.
By your grading.
Huh?
I said by your grading.
No, I'm not grading it. Remember, he's the target.
I'll be his faithful.
All your fatwas go to him. I didn't do it. Okay. The great empires of the world start. Imperial thinking comes from this region. These are huge. Today we talk about superpowers and all that stuff. Okay. But where does this begin? This begins in the ancient Middle East. First one was Hammurabi's empire, 18th and 19th centuries, BC. Then comes the Assyrians, the Bad News Bears of the ancient Middle East. Coming about the 11th century, ends about the 8th century BC. They conquered everything from the Euphrates River and Persian Gulf all the way over to the Mediterranean. They are master builders and defensive fortifications. But they are definitely empire builders. That tradition of empire building is really big time with Hammurabi, and then later with the Assyrians, and then finally, the last great empire builder from the region is Nebuchadnezzar, who builds the empire out from the city of Babylon. And that's 6th century BC. It only lasts about 120 years. And remember the last person from that region that tried to emulate Hammurabi, the Assyrians, and the Babylonians? Who said, I'm a great empire builder too? That was Saddam, yeah. Well, it's a natural course of action because you inherit all this. You see, when you go to that part of the world today, you still see remnants of a lot of this. Not all of it, but a lot of it. And you can really get the sense of huge impression. Yeah.
Did Babylonian laws come from Hammurabi?
Yeah, the law codes that we're talking about the other day,
Yeah.
that's Hammurabi's.
Right.
And
You know,
that's-
the
that's-
eye for an eye was huge during the Babylonian time, so that, but Hammurabi's law code came first and then it.
Right, a lot of those law codes
Part of
are
that.
eye for an eye.
Yeah.
Yeah. In fact, they're very similar to a lot of the law codes in the Old Testament. Very similar. But what makes them different is that in the context of Hammurabi's law code, which there are several hundred, they're done to maintain basically a civil order. It's not connected to any kind of worship. In the Mosaic Law Code, you do these things because you love God. It's tied to the worship of God. Honor your parents, so your life may be long in the land. Thou shalt not steal. You should not bear false witness. Murder. All those things, but because you love God. It's tied to the worship of God. So it is, what's the word? It's called ethical monotheism among the early Israelites. Ethical monotheism. You have the same thing in Christianity and the same thing in Islam. You do certain things because you believe in God. In Hammurabi's law code, God is not part of it. There's no God. There are gods, but this is not why you're doing it. You're doing it to keep the lid on, making sure society remains civilized and uninterrupted and nobody's killing anybody. I mean, if you had a lawless, nothing's worse than a lawless country. A country without laws, or if you have the laws, nobody's obeying them, just everybody's done doing their own thing. That's a scary situation.
Mexico City.
It can be. Yeah.
It's very similar.
Well, all the bodies they found recently. Yeah. Okay, so the great empires, and then you have the coming of the Persians. About the 7th century BC into that high plateau area. It's green, the green up here on the map. The old Persian Empire arrives here. You have a change. They believe in basically one God, a God of good called Ahura Mazda. But they have to account for evil. Why is evil in the world? It's a big question. It's a philosophical question, but it's also a pretty interesting idea. If God is good and God is perfect, God is great, and all these, why is there evil? Where did evil come from? And their view is evil comes from because there's also a very big, equally big, very bad God named Angru Maidu. A-N-G-R-U-M-A-I-D-U. Angru Maidu. This is called Persian dualism. The God of good, eternal God of good, constantly doing battle with the God of evil. And in the end of time, and here we come to this time thing again, linear time, at the end of time, the God of good will win. He'll bring about what? A new world. New earth. Perfect harmony. But we need to help this God, and therefore the religion of Zoroaster now fits in with this, using earth, fire, and water, part of the ceremony. Ritual purity, and your belief in Ahura Mazda, you help bring this about at the end of time. You help defeat the God of evil. So in that sense, Persian dualism has, this human connection to it. There's very few Zoroastrians left in Persia today. Almost none. But they were around for quite a while. You still have small communities of them. And you can tell when you're around a community because they don't bury their dead. They put the dead on a tower, they call it a tower of silence. And then the birds of prey come and eat them. It's okay to go that way. I don't necessarily look forward to being buried. Of course, I won't know anything about it. I don't think. I don't know.
Don't they always keep like a flame burning in their house too?
They do.
Yeah.
Yeah, in fact, a family that lived near me came from Iran. They used to always say Persia. Came from Persia, and they were practicing Zoroastrianism.
There's a professor at RCC that is Zoroastrianism.
Is he an American?
Yeah, she's from India, but she moved
Oh,
here.
she's from India.
She lives in like a Parsi. She lived in like a Parsi community in Bombay.
Okay, good. Yeah, that's. I'd like to find somebody that is into that, to talk to.
It's really interesting to
Yeah.
talk to her. She's really open about it.
Good.
Lucy Samawala from the UNA was the president. He's a Zoroastrian from India. You met Lucy one
I know who you're talking about. I remember him.
Yeah, he's a Zoroastrian. He practices, and he's from India, but he's an American now.
Okay, yeah.
But they outlawed that in the Islamic regime. They were still doing the ceremony. but
It's
they
interesting
outlawed it.
because the
So now
Persians-
they hide it. They hide it.
Right, the current regime outlaws everything.
They outlawed- Well,
Everything.
especially
A
about
lot.
the Zoroastrians.
Right.
But there still are quite a few in a certain area.
But at this date and time, these people, when they came in, were the most liberal, tolerant group ever.
Right.
They show up in the Middle East and they don't force anybody to worship what they worship. You just should do what you're gonna do.
And Zoroaster
Yeah.
himself looks very Christ-like,
Yeah.
if you see his picture, so.
They had cameras.
No, they have
Well, anyway, you know the story about Japanese trying to, I'm glad my Japanese girl is not here today.
She ran away.
Japanese tried to, they were developing a new car, and they were gonna sell it to the Iranian market.
Oh, that's right.
And they developed this thing in 1978, and they were gonna, so they had a couple 100,000 they're gonna sell into Iran and Persia. It's called the Mazda. That's where they got it, because it's based on the Ahura Mazda, the god of good. Well, not like any Persians remember Ahura Mazda much, but but as soon as they got this car developed, rotary engine and all that stuff, they had the revolution in Iran, so they sent all these Mazdas over here. Because we buy anything. Americans will buy anything. Keep it in mind when you go back, you entrepreneurs in Saudi Arabia, when you go back to Saudi Arabia, a motorized camel. Somebody is going to, in Texas, is going to buy it. Promise. Okay. The Persians will conquer everything from northwest India to the Mediterranean, including the Turkish peninsula. That's all going to fall under the Persian conquest. It's going to be the largest empire that region has ever seen. It will survive until the year 333, when a new world conqueror comes on the scene, and we have one of the greatest traditions of military genius ever, and that's Alexander the Great, who put together an army of about 20,000 and defeated the Persians in 3 major battles, took over the Persian Empire, and proclaimed religious toleration to anybody, but declared himself to be a god. And we know how that worked out. He died June 10th, 323. So I guess he wasn't a god. But he brings now, what changes the Middle East a bit is the introduction of Greek ideas, Greek culture into that region. And it creates a very different kind of culture for, I'd say, probably the next 600 years. It's called a Hellenistic culture. It's a very inventive culture. A very integrated culture, combining most of the skills, the inventions, literature of the ancient Middle East with a very different world of the Greek world. They come together in a kind of a religious and cultural accommodation. It's the time in which you have Buddha being worshipped in Afghanistan, and the Buddha figures are being carved by Greeks who have converted to Buddhism. And you look at these big statues, they're called the Gandhara Buddhas. They look like Buddha's dressed wearing a toga. And he looks like the god Apollo. It's really strange. I mean, you're looking at this is real religious fusion, cultural accommodation. Find the same thing in Egypt. We find all the Egyptian gods dressed wearing Greek outfits and posing in the Greek orator pose, one hand up. It just looks strange. And you have things being done in the Greek language. We have the Old Testament translated for the very first time in the city of Alexandria, named after Alexander the Great, translated into Greek. It's called the Septuagint version. Building of one of the great, I'd say, really inventive things at that time, and that's the building of the Pharaoh's Lighthouse, which is considered one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Pharaoh's Lighthouse, huge, probably over 300 feet high. It had a light that could shine, that could be seen 30 miles out at sea. Rather remarkable. We have no idea how they fueled it. Because one thing that, well, they, burned wood. No, it's Egypt, there is no wood. They didn't have wood then, they don't have it now. So they're using some kind of fuel to keep this thing lit. It's always been a mystery. They had multiple elevator shafts to haul these things up into this thing, and then you had the same kind of light functioning in the daytime. What's doing that? Some kind of multiple mirrors. And we know that the city of Alexandria became actually the intellectual capital of the world. They had manuscripts from all over the place, as far away as India and China, from the Greek world, from the world of the Middle East, tons of manuscripts. That's why we thank God, because this is why we know something about the Middle East at that time, is because of these manuscripts. Because the Alexandrian Library collected them. That library had at one time 3 million volumes. We don't know what destroyed the library. We don't know when that library was destroyed. But some manuscripts did survive, maybe 1 million or so, but we've lost a lot with the destruction of 2 out of the 3 million manuscripts in their possession. They collected manuscripts. Anybody that came into Alexandria, if they had a manuscript with them, they had to turn it over to the library. They'd give them money for it, and what they would do is then they'd write a copy of it, and they give the guy the copy back. If you walked in with a manuscript actually written by Plato, let's say you had a copy of Plato's Republic, and you show up at Alexandria, boy, you better stash it. No, they're going to search you down and see what you got. They're collecting. I mean, this is library building with a vengeance, man. You're busted for books. What? Okay. People here can't even read. They don't know what this means. Okay. So they take then they take it and they copy it and they give you the copy. You'd say, wait a minute, this is signed by Plato. I want this back. Shut up and go. Take the copy. But because they were doing all this copying, it's the reason we still have anything from the ancient world left, because they did it. And then both the library disappears. 3 things disappear. Number 1, the body of Alexander the Great. It was a shrine worshipped even by the Caesars. We don't know where it is, whatever happened to it. The other thing that disappears is the Pharaoh's lighthouse. Destroyed by an earthquake in the 14th century. Massive earthquake. We now know there's a fault line that runs right through the Nile Delta, just past the city of Alexandria.
When was that?
In the 14th century, AD. The third thing that disappears,
80.
it's AD, not BC. And then you have the disappearance of the museum and library. There's all kinds of traditions about what happened to it. Some say it was burned by the Romans and Julius Caesar when he invaded Egypt. No. Part of the city caught on fire at that time, but part of the library caught on fire, but it wasn't destroyed, because that library stayed in operation for the next 4 centuries. But it disappears. We know that when the Arabs conquered Egypt in the 7th century AD, the library was still there. Pretty sure of that, because they began to copy the manuscripts. And they talked about it. But something happens, and we do not know. We do not know. So the Hellenistic world becomes one of the strangest worlds that we know nothing about, because so much of what they had has disappeared. But then the whole region is conquered by Rome at the end of the 1st century BC. So Rome moves in as the last of the great superpowers indigenous to the region. The Italians will defeat Antony and Cleopatra. Romans will defeat Antony and Cleopatra. The Battle of Actium in 31 BC. And the end of Egypt comes to an end as Pharaonic Egypt. So Egypt lasted altogether as an organized, unified country, even under conquest. It lasted from 3100 BC to 31 BC. Who was the last ruler of Egypt? Independent ruler of Egypt was Cleopatra. So you have all this rich heritage going on here. Now, something comes up on the ruins of Rome, when Rome divides in the 3rd century. Eastern Roman Empire, Western Roman Empire. The Eastern Roman Empire, let's take the West first, will remain independent, ruled by the city of Rome. And how many remember the date of the fall of Rome, the Roman Empire? Come on.
476.
476. It took the man from Bend, Oregon to say that. 476 AD disappears. Inundated by Germanic tribes. Life expectancy dropped from roughly 55 and 60 in the Roman Empire because of the hygiene issue. And now it falls back to roughly 32 years of age. Amazing what transpires over a few generations because of the collapse of the water system, the drainage systems, the Roman baths, and all that stuff. Those hairy Germans never took a bath, and they died young. They probably died because they smell so bad. Okay. So Rome disappears in the west, but the eastern half of the empire continues. It's called the Byzantine Empire. Byzantine Empire, or Eastern Roman Empire. They speak Greek. It's the wealthiest part of what had been the old Roman Empire. Its capital is today the city of Istanbul. But what was it called before that? Constantinople, the city of Constantine. He ordered it built. It was built in the started being built in the 4th century. The religion of the Eastern Roman Empire is Greek Orthodoxy. The religion of the West, so already in Christianity, which became the predominant religion of the Roman Empire by the end of the 3rd century, already they're divided. Roman Catholics versus Greek Orthodox. They don't speak the same language. Latin is the language of the West, Greek is the language of the East. They have a pope in the West. They've got a patriarch in the East. In the West, they have statues in the churches. In the East, they said that's wrong. Why? Because in the Ten Commandments it says, you shall worship no graven image. That's a statue, man. So how do you substitute for it? So the Eastern Orthodox, they have paintings. Why? Because the painting's only two-dimensional. Length and width, no depth. If you have a statue, give depth. If you've got a statue, you're a heretic. Not good. All right. They divide. One, you're forced to marry, and the other, you cannot marry. You have to, in order to be a priest in the Orthodox tradition, you have to be married. In order to be a priest in the Roman Catholic tradition, you can't marry. Or you don't tell anybody. Whatever. So, Eastern Orthodoxy now inherits, as its mainstay, a lot of the Middle East. Controls the Middle East in the period between, let's say, roughly 400 AD, right down to about the year 650 AD. They're very strict on the application of the worship of Eastern Orthodoxy. But they have a large population in Egypt that are different. The Egyptian Christians worship, they have worship known as Coptic Christianity. It's unique, it's different. They're still there. I don't know how many are in Egypt. Between 10 and 12 million out of 80 million people, between 10 and 12 million are what? Coptic Christians. They have one of the largest cathedrals, and they could not stand the Greek Orthodox. So as a result, the Greek Orthodox state, Byzantine Empire, launched a war against Egypt, their own subjects. Persecuted them, tortured them, killed them, in order to get them to convert to Orthodox Christianity. I don't know what happened to brotherly love here, but it breaks down along doctrinal lines. Okay. There's a lot of that went on. Also, the Coptic Christians were socially discriminated against by the Byzantines. Coptic Christians in Egypt said, we want out from under this. So a couple of centuries later, they made a deal with the infant Muslim military about the year 640 and said, if you invade Egypt, come and do it. This is our invitation. Egypt did not try to fight the Muslim invasions of the 7th century. They invited them as deliverers. And they said, come, but just let us continue our own worship. And when the Muslim armies came into Egypt, that's exactly what they did. They threw out the Byzantines and let the native Egyptians worship their own religion. No harm, no foul, we'll pay tax, we'll take care of it, and we'll support you. Worked out pretty well for a long time. So, meantime, the Byzantines had a great enemy, military enemy that they faced. It's the revived Persian Empire known as the Parthian Empire, and later known as the Sassanian Empire, S-A-S-S-A-N-I-D, the Sassanids. It's the last phase of the Persian Empire. They're mortal enemies, and the dividing line is right along the Euphrates River. It separates the Byzantine conquest to the east and the Persian conquest toward the west. And so you have this, and this went on for this huge conflict, went on for roughly 40 years prior to the birth of Islam in the region.